Earlier this week, I placed an online order for some groceries at Sam's Club, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I immediately realized that I forgot a certain item on the order. What I forgot was my Parmesan cheese. I know, tragedy, right? So I immediately got back online to see if I could add Parmesan cheese to my order, but there wasn't a way to do it. So against my better judgment, I decided to begin an online chat with tech support, customer support. And so I managed to get my way past the chat bot and to talk to an actual human, I suppose. And they connected me with Lester from El Salvador. And now I don't know a whole lot about El Salvador. I've come to learn that they have prisons. They have margaritas. And apparently they have a Sam's Club customer service agent named Lester. And so I told Lester about my problem, about my lack of Parmesan cheese. And he replied, "Let me check on that." And then a second later, he said, "Do not worry. I can see how important this is to you." And I thought, thank goodness Lester is on my side. Somebody finally understands my problems. He's going to help me. I don't know what I will do without Lester to calm my nerves until I get my Parmesan cheese. And as Lester's long-distance inquiry from El Salvador was connecting to the Sam's Club here in Lubbock, he filled the time and he asked me another question. "So, how has your week been?" And I thought, I'm really developing a friendship with this guy. And he's getting to know me. And so I told my El Salvadoran friend, "Pretty good," until I forgot my Parmesan cheese. Well, he finally received word back from Lubbock, and he told me, "Unfortunately, the order has already been filled, and your Parmesan cheese cannot be added to it." Well, you can imagine my distress, my disappointment. But it wasn't Lester's fault. It was mine. I recognized that, so I gave Lester 5 stars when the email came with this picture. And now, as tragic as my Parmesan cheese story may seem, it probably pales in comparison to whatever you may have faced this week. I mean, we've got all kinds of things we have to face that aren't as silly as my little problem. We have financial issues and relationship issues, health issues. Some of the things we can deal with are pretty serious. And truth be known, some of us may be actually going through an actual crisis right now. And maybe that's why you came to church. I don't know. Maybe you came to church to hear the pastor talk about Parmesan cheese. But there's another chance, and maybe you came to church today to see if God might have any answers to your problems. And the good news is that, yes, God has the answers to your problems because God has all the answers. But as far as our problems go, there's something that you need to know. God doesn't usually do little quick fixes when we have a problem. God's not a genie where we can rub a magic lamp and get our wishes granted to us, of course. What God offers is a relationship with Him, and if you'll say yes to that relationship, what God offers you is that He will be with you throughout your problems, throughout the good times and the bad, even your crisis that might hit from time to time. Well, no matter what kind of problem you may be dealing with, Jesus can relate to that because He's been through much worse. In the Gospel of John, chapter 7, we read in verse 1 that after these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for He was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill Him. Yes, there goes my grandson. He just wants to participate in the sermon. But I'm going to spoil him later this afternoon. So, anyway, we're looking forward to Easter lunch together. Let me read that again. In John chapter 7, you can follow along in your Bible, or it's on the screen behind me. After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for He was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, I don't know if anyone's actually tried to kill you before, but that's what Jesus was facing. And you might wonder, well, who would want to kill Jesus? Well, verse 1 tells us, the Jews. You might be thinking, well, that's a little anti-Semitic, isn't it? All the Jews? Well, no, not all the Jews. It's referring to the Jewish authorities, the religious leaders of the day, the Sanhedrin. And you might wonder, well, what were they so upset about that they wanted to kill Jesus? Well, it's because Jesus had a tendency to call them out for their hypocrisy and their disobedience to God, and they were losing face. They were losing respect from amongst the people that they were supposed to lead. And so the religious authorities, they were down south in Judea, in and around Jerusalem, and that's why Jesus at this point in time was up north in Galilee. Jesus knew that he would eventually have to die on the cross for our sins, but not yet. It wasn't time yet. What it was time for was the feast. And we read in verse 2 these words, "Now the feast of the Jews, the Feast of Booths, was near." The Jewish people in that day, and even sometimes today, celebrate 7 large festivals or feasts. But this one, this is the biggie. This is everyone's favorite. This party is so big that the Bible in verse 2 calls it the feast. Sort of like, in that respect, the Super Bowl. You know, every year, the NFL plays 286 games, but there's only one big game. And that game is so big that my Dallas Cowboys have decided not to play in that game. It's been 199 games for them since they last played in that game. My oldest son was 1. He's now 30. So that's a long time. Mathematically, that's pretty impressive. But this was the feast of all the feasts that they had, the Feast of Booths. And I want you to just try to imagine that you might be there in ancient Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, surrounded by 500,000 people that show up for this feast. That's how big it was. I mean, that's approximately the size of the crowd that came out for the World Series parade for the Texas Rangers a couple of years ago. And did you catch, though, where this feast is? It's in Jerusalem. The Feast of Booths is in Jerusalem. That's where the bad guys are. And that's the people that want to kill Jesus. And so his brothers up north and him are going to have a conversation. We read in verse 3, "Therefore his brothers said to him," and let's pause right there because some of you may not realize that Jesus had literal physical brothers. You might say, I thought Jesus' mother, Mary, was a virgin. Well, she was when Jesus was born, but after that, she and Joseph had kids. And so here's Jesus' younger brothers, and they began to talk to him, and his brothers said to him, "Leave here up north and go south, go down into Judea." You might wonder, well, what kind of brother would tell him that? That's where the people are that want to kill him. I mean, why are Jesus' brothers telling him to go south to Judea when the bad guys are after him down south? Well, that's not very brotherly. I mean, it's one thing to tell your brother, "Mom wants you to do the dishes," really when she told you to do it. You know, that's one thing. But to actually send your brother into harm's way, what are they thinking? What's going on here? Well, here's what happened. A few chapters earlier in John chapter 5, Jesus healed a man who was an invalid. And he healed the man on the Sabbath, on the holy day of each week. He healed the man on that Sabbath day, and the religious authorities did not like it because no one is supposed to do work on the Sabbath. And the religious authorities said, healing someone, well, that can be defined as work. And so they didn't like it. They got mad at Jesus, mad enough to kill Jesus. That's when they decided to kill Jesus. They just hadn't pulled it off yet. And so Jesus left that area, and he went up north to Galilee. And while he was there, he fed, miraculously, 5,000 people. Well, these people must have been Baptists because they immediately liked this guy. I mean, anyone who can pull off a potluck like that, miraculously, we're going to follow him. They loved him. They said, let's make him king. Well, the crowd began to follow Jesus, but it was all for the wrong reason because they could get a free meal out of it. And so Jesus began to teach them some very hard teachings, and the crowd began to dwindle away pretty quickly. Because we like free food, but hard teachings, not so much. And so they began to run away. And all of a sudden, Jesus was a lot less popular than he was before. And so his brothers, and this is my paraphrase, his brothers are saying to him, hey, you think you're the Messiah? Okay, Mr. Messiah, man. Why don't you go down to the feast? That's where the Messiah is supposed to be, down in Jerusalem. Why don't you do these works down there? If you think you're the Messiah and all these people are supposed to follow you. I mean, the Messiah eventually has to make his way to Jerusalem and be known in Jerusalem. No better way, no better time and place to do it than the feast that everyone's going to be at. And so his brother said to him in verses 3 through 5, leave here up north and go into Judea so that your disciples may see your works, which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself publicly to the world. For not even his brothers were believing in him. So what about it? Should Jesus listen to his brothers? Should Jesus' brothers determine God's will for Jesus? Well, the answer to that is no. So Jesus replied to them in verse 6, my time is not yet here, but your time is always here. Let me pause right there, because back in that day, and even today, some Jewish people had a belief that every man had what was called his time. A man has his time, meaning it is a certain point in a man's life when every man comes into his own, when every man finds purpose in life, when every man finds fulfillment in life. He finally discovers what he's supposed to do in this world. And so Jesus was saying to his brothers, my time has not yet come. I will not allow you to dictate God's will for my life. I know God's will, Jesus was saying, because God's will is my will. I know God's timing, because God's timing is my timing. And it is not yet time for me to go into Jerusalem and to confront my persecutors. Not yet. But as for you, my brothers, if you think it's your time to go to the feast, by all means go. Any time is your time. Then Jesus added, the world cannot hate you, my brothers, but it hates me, because I bear witness about it that its deeds are evil. Jesus' brothers weren't going around calling out the world for its evil deeds. Jesus was. So the world could love Jesus' brothers. They were on the same team, if you will. But Jesus was calling the world out, and so the world hated Jesus. By the way, the world still hates Jesus today. And the world hates those who follow Jesus too. If you want to follow Jesus, count the cost. If you want to follow him, understand you will be rejected by the world. You may be rejected by your friends, or by your family, or by your schoolmates. You might not get that promotion at work, and you might think, well, that has nothing to do with me being a follower of Jesus. Yeah, maybe it doesn't. But there may be a cost that you pay simply because you decide to follow Jesus. So what's it going to be? What do you want to gain? Do you want to gain Jesus, or do you want to gain the world? You can't have both. Jesus continued, and he said, go up to the feast yourselves. I'm not yet going up to this feast because my time has not yet been fulfilled. There's going to be a big caravan coming from the north all the way to Jerusalem. Jesus was not going to be a part of the big caravan, and he was certainly not going to let the crowd push him into revealing his messiahship at a time that was too early. Now, Jesus was still going to the feast, but he was going on his own. Verse 9, having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as in secret. And so the Jews, the authorities, the religious authorities, they were seeking him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying, he's a good man, and others saying, no, on the contrary, he leads the crowd astray. Yet no one was speaking openly about him for fear of the Jews, the religious authorities. But when it was now the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. So this feast is 7 days long. A certain number of days had passed before Jesus finally arrived, and he went up into the temple area, and he found a public place, and he began to teach in this very public place. And then the Jews were marveling, saying, "How has this man become learned and not having been educated?" So Jesus answered them and said, "My teaching is not mine, but from him who sent me." In other words, Jesus was saying this: my teachings, I didn't learn it from the rabbis. If I learned it from the rabbis, then my teachings would be their teachings. But my teachings are not their teachings. My teachings are from the one who sent me. And if you haven't figured that out, he's talking about God the Father. Then Jesus added, "If anyone is willing to do his will, that person will know about the teaching, whether it is of God or I speak from myself." In other words, here's a good question. How do we know if a teaching is from God? Here's the answer from Jesus. The only people that know whether a teaching is from God are those who do the will of God. If you won't do God's will, then you can't ever know God's will. It's a heart issue. It's an obedience issue. Now, let me just tell you right now, if you've been living life your own way, and today you think that you may be ready to begin living God's way, let me say, good for you. I would love to talk to you. I would love for you to fill out one of those yellow decision cards and hand it to me or put it in the offering and connection card box so that I can get back in touch with you, because I want to show you what an incredible journey it is to walk with Jesus. When you begin to walk with Jesus, his teachings come alive. You begin to understand. And so, if you're not yet on that journey, I would invite you to begin that journey, as so many others in this room have. But on the other hand, if today you are absolutely committed to living your own way, without God, without Jesus, if you refuse to let Jesus come into your life, then his teachings will always be foreign to you. You won't understand them. So it's one or the other. You're living with Jesus or without him. There comes a point in your life where you have to make a decision. Jesus continues in verse 18. He says, "He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him." In other words, when Jesus taught, when you read the teachings of Jesus, who did he point people to? He pointed people to God. But what does everyone else do, even today? What does everyone else do? They want to make a name for themselves. Buy my book. Subscribe to my podcast. Support my advertisers. Everyone else glorifies themselves. But that's not what Jesus did. He glorified God. And that's why Jesus is the only one who is true. And there is no unrighteousness in him. Jesus continues in verse 19. He said, "Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you does the law? Why do you seek to kill me?" What's he saying? Jesus is saying that God's law came to Moses with the 10 Commandments many years before. And one of the 10 Commandments, and this one's a biggie, is "Thou shalt not kill." And yet, what are the religious leaders trying to do to Jesus? That exact same thing. They're trying to kill him. And so Jesus calls them out for disobeying the law that they claimed to teach and to obey. Now, some of the people in the crowd were from out of town, and they had no idea about all of this plot to try to kill Jesus. And the crowd answered. In verse 20, he said, "You have a demon. Who seeks to kill you?" They thought Jesus was paranoid. But they didn't have an idea. They didn't have a clue what was really going on. And Jesus replied to them in verse 21. He answered them and said, "I did one work, and you all marvel. What Jesus was saying is this. You know, the last time that I was here in this area, down south, here in Jerusalem, I healed an invalid on the Sabbath. That was from God. And yet the religious leaders accused me of committing a sin, and now they want to kill me. So Jesus is referring to this one work, this healing of the man on the Sabbath day. And now Jesus is going to double down on his argument. In fact, he's going to go on the offensive. He's going to call out the religious leaders for what they've done and what their stance is. And so what Jesus is about to do, he's about to make an argument based on circumcision, which is a practice that by the Jewish law says that should happen to baby boys on the 8th day after their birth. And if a baby Jewish boy on the 8th day after his birth is not circumcised, then God's law has been broken. That's the rule. But what if the 8th day falls on a Sabbath day when no work is supposed to be done? Is circumcising a baby boy considered work that is forbidden on the Sabbath? Well, the religious leaders knew this was an issue that they had to deal with, and they had made a decision that they allowed circumcision on the Sabbath. Think about it. They're going to allow circumcision on the Sabbath, but not Jesus healing a man who had been an invalid all of his life. That's not allowed on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus puts it this way. For this reason, Moses has given you circumcision, not because it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. And so Jesus had this conversation with some of the crowd, some of them from outside of town, but now those that were Jerusalemites, those that lived in Jerusalem, they join in. And they were the ones who knew how much the religious leaders wanted Jesus dead. And they're absolutely astonished that Jesus is teaching in the temple area publicly. Verse 25, so some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, is this not the man whom they're seeking to kill? And look, he is speaking openly, and they are saying nothing to him. Do the rulers truly know that this is the Christ? They're saying he's right here. Everyone sees him. Surely they see him too. They walk past him. They see him teaching, and yet they do nothing. And they began to wonder, have they secretly become convinced that maybe this guy Jesus is the Messiah? Is that why they leave him alone? And then other Jerusalemites joined in the party, and they said, however, verse 27, however, we know where this man is from, but whenever the Christ comes, no one knows where he is from. And so they're arguing with one another. Some are saying, yeah, he's the Messiah. Others are saying, no, he's not. How do we know he's not? Because we know where he's from. He's from Galilee. He's from Nazareth. But according to our traditions, no one's supposed to know where the Messiah comes from. And so they conclude that Jesus can't be the Messiah. Verse 28, then Jesus cried out in the temple, teaching and saying, you both know me and know where I am from, and I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true. Jesus was saying, yes, I'm from Nazareth in Galilee, but really I'm from God. He sent me. And then Jesus accuses them of not even knowing God. He who sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me. Think about it. Everyone's there to celebrate their loyalty to God, and Jesus says, you don't even know him. Things are getting spicy. And so, verse 30, they didn't like it. They were seeking to seize him, yet no one laid his hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Jesus' time was not going to be determined by his mother or by his brothers or by a hysterical mob, but by God alone. But many of the crowd believed in him, and others were saying, when the Christ comes, will he do more signs than this man did? Well, now the Jewish authorities are going to step forward. We read in verse 32, the Pharisees heard the crowd whispering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees sent officers to seize him. Therefore Jesus said, for a little while longer I am with you, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me, and I will not find me, and where I am you cannot come. And the Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Is he intending to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? Is he heading out of the country? What is this statement that he said? You will seek me and you will not find me, and where I am you cannot come. They didn't understand that Jesus was saying he's going to return to his Father in heaven. Well, finally we get to the climax of Jesus' trip to Jerusalem. And let me explain something about the Feast of Booths. Every day, for 7 days, during the Feast of Booths, at 9 a.m., a shofar, which is a horn a trumpet really, made from a ram's horn, a shofar would be blown to announce the beginning of that day's ceremonies. And a choir of priests would be on the top of the steps in the women's court where everyone could see them, everyone could hear their voices as they sang. And at the appointed time, the massive crowd would begin to chant from memory Psalms 113 to 118, 6 psalms from memory, called the Hallel. And then numerous other festivities and loud elements of worship would occur all throughout the day. And then every day at 3 p.m., the shofar would blow again. This marked the beginning of what is called the water drawing ceremony. What was this about? Zechariah chapter 14 in the Old Testament tells us that the Messiah will bring living water flowing out of Jerusalem. And so this water drawing ceremony celebrated the coming Messiah. Only they didn't know who it was, and they didn't know when he was coming. And the crowd again would begin chanting Psalms 113 to 118. And they would get to verse 25 of Psalm 118, and they would repeat verse 25 in a large chant over and over again. That verse says, "O Yahweh, save! O Yahweh, succeed!" And the crowd would chant this back and forth to one another. And then the high priest would come out, and he would take a golden pitcher like this one, and he would begin to make his way out of the temple. And he would go down a series of steps, down a steep hill, to the pool of Siloam, about 700 yards away. And he would dip the pitcher into the pool of Siloam, and he would get about 2.5 pints of water. And then he would begin to make his way back up the steps, back to the temple, as the crowd cheered and as the crowd chanted. And as he approached the temple, the crowd would get louder and louder, saying, "Oh, Yahweh, save! Oh, Yahweh, succeed!" And when the high priest finally made his way to the great altar, he was welcomed back with 3 loud blasts from the shofar. He stood on the west side of the altar, while another priest, holding a pitcher of wine, stood on the east side of the altar, and they simultaneously poured on the altar both the water and the wine. And when the pitcher was completely empty, the priest would hold up the golden pitcher, and the crowd would just go immensely insane. They would cheer. And at that point, larger-than-life menorahs would be lit up at the temple, and everyone would begin to make their way out to wherever they were staying for the night. And the menorahs would stay lit throughout the night. But on the last day, the great day of the feast, things were just a little bit different. When the high priest made his way back to the altar with the pitcher filled with water, he slowly walked around the altar, 7 times. Every time he walked around the altar, he would hold up the pitcher and the crowd would cheer. 7 times he would go around. But on his 7th trip around the altar, as he held up the pitcher, the loud blast of the shofar would sound. And the crowd knew that it was time for them to become completely silent. And those that were nearby would sit on the ground so that everyone else behind them could see the priest pouring out the water one last time. And as the high priest paused, and as all eyes were squarely on him in the silence of that moment, that is when Jesus stood and cried out, saying, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, he who believes in me." As the scripture said, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. But this, John tells us in his gospel, he spoke of the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were going to receive. For the Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Approximately 6 months later, Jesus would die on the cross to pay for our sins. And then he rose from the grave with a glorified body. And after he ascended to heaven, the Spirit of God was given at that point. The Spirit of God came to dwell in all who believe in Jesus. That same Spirit of God dwells in the life of every true believer in Jesus Christ today. So what about you? Do you need the rivers of living water? Do you need the Spirit of God himself to come into your life? Are you ready today to be forgiven, to be free from your guilt, to experience the life that God intends you to have? Are you ready to believe in him? If you are thirsty, come to him and drink. If you believe in him, as the scripture said, from his innermost being flow rivers of living water.